No declaration of war accompanied the signal, nor were there demands for surrender. The unencrypted navigation beacon simply broadcast 3 words, "We are coming." A suffocating silence fell over the Galactic Council chamber as thousands of species warlords who had incinerated galaxies and diplomats who had bartered away star systems went mute. They were intimately familiar with the legends of what crawled from the dirt of Sol 3, and they understood a terrifying truth. Once humanity makes a promise, not even hell can stand in its way. Henry stared at the holographic projection suspended in the center of the grand amphitheater. The blue light washed over his face, catching the deep exhaustion-carved lines around his eyes. He didn't blink. He couldn't. Around him, the Galactic Council chamber was a masterclass in engineered intimidation. High vaulted ceilings of polished black stone. Tiered seating meant to make the lesser delegations feel small. Banners of 1,000 unified worlds hanging in still sterile air. Usually this room was a deafening roar of overlapping arguments, translated shouting matches, and the smug posturing of apex predators in expensive suits. Right now you could hear a pin drop. You could hear the hum of the ventilation system. You could hear the rattling breath of Ambassador Cole, 3 rows down, his respiratory implants, struggling to keep up with his sudden crippling panic. The hologram wasn't a fleet deployment. It wasn't a list of demands. It was a localized pulse repeating on a standard rudimentary radio frequency. "We are coming." Henry gripped the edge of his podium. The metal was cold, but his palms were slick with sweat. He looked to his left. General Walker stood by the tactical console. Walker, who had ordered the orbital bombardment of the Kepler dissidents without a twitch of his jaw. Walker, whose chest was heavy with metals forged from the melted-down armor of his enemies. Walker was shaking. It was a subtle tremor in the hands, quickly hidden behind his back, but Henry saw it. That small vibration sent a spike of pure, unadulterated ice down Henry's spine. When the butcher of the outer rim trembled, the politicians were already dead. "Turn it off," Henry said. His voice was a rasp barely carrying over the microphones. The technician in the pit below a young aide named Sullivan scrambled over his console. He slammed his hand onto the cutoff switch. The blue light died. The projection vanished. But the words still hung in the air, burned into the retinas of every delegate in the room. The silence returned heavier this time. It felt like the pressure of a deep ocean trench crushing inward on their ribs. "Distance," Henry demanded, forcing the word out. He had to keep them focused. If the panic took root, if the delegations broke and ran for the evacuation shuttles, the resulting stampede would tear the station apart before the humans even arrived. Sullivan swallowed hard, his fingers dancing nervously over the glass interface. "The signal is, 'It's moving, sir. Fast.'" "Give me a number, Sullivan." 4 sectors out. They bypassed the border checkpoints. They didn't engage the automated defense grids. They just drove right through them. Sullivan looked up, his face pale. The drones opened fire. The human ships didn't even raise kinetic barriers. They just took the hits and kept their heading. A murmur rippled through the lower tiers. It wasn't a sound of conversation. It was the sound of a trapped animal realizing the cage door is locked. Henry closed his eyes. He remembered the briefings from 10 years ago, the first contact. The arrogant assumption that humanity was just another primitive, hyper-aggressive species that could be brought to heel with a show of force and a few crippling trade sanctions. The Council had encountered 100 races like them before. You blockade their homeworld, starve them of hypermatter, and wait for them to beg for a seat at the table. That was the protocol. It had worked for 1,000 years, but humanity didn't beg. They didn't fracture into warring factions. They didn't collapse under the weight of an embargo. They got quiet, and then they got to work. "They're burning their own engines out," Walker said, his voice tight. He stepped closer to the empty space where the hologram had been. Moving at that speed, ignoring defense grids, they are taking structural damage just to close the distance. It's not a military formation. It's a stampede. A stampede implies fear, Henry noted grimly. Walker shook his head. No, a stampede implies momentum. They don't care what they hit. They don't care what they lose. They just want to reach us. Henry looked across the faces of the council. Some were reaching for their personal communicators, desperately trying to contact their homeworlds. Others just sat there, staring at the empty air, paralyzed. They had poked the beast. The bureaucrats had authorized a pacification strike on a distant human mining outpost 2 weeks ago to teach Sol 3 a lesson about unauthorized expansion. It was supposed to be a surgical warning, a slap on the wrist. Instead, they had issued a death warrant for the council. Henry keyed his microphone. "Lock down the station. Nobody leaves. If they see ships breaking orbit, they will read it as a hostile maneuver. We stay here. We wait." Ambassador Hayes, a staunch hardliner from the inner colonies, stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. "Wait for what? For them to butcher us. We have the core fleet in orbit. We have 300 capital ships. You want us to sit here while a pack of apes, Ambassador?" Walker interrupted his voice, dropping to a dangerous gravelly register. "If you order the core fleet to engage, the humans won't fight them. They will ram them. They will turn their drives into thermonuclear variables and detonate them against our hulls. They will break our 300 pristine ships into 3 million pieces of shrapnel, and then they will walk over the wreckage to get to this room." Hayes opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Walker, then at Henry. "You don't fight humanity," Walker said softly, looking back at the dark tactical table. "You just hope they kill you quickly." "Show them," Henry commanded, stepping down from his podium. He needed the room to understand. He needed Hayes and the rest of the grandstanding fools to see exactly why the core fleet was useless. Sullivan hesitated. "Sir, the classified files? There is nothing left to classify, Sullivan. If we're going to die today, these people are going to know exactly why." Sullivan tapped a sequence on his console. The overhead lights dimmed, plunging the chamber into a dark, cinematic gloom. A new projection flickered to life. It wasn't clean tactical data. It was raw, unedited helmet cam footage from the pacification strike on the human outpost New Providence. The footage was shaky, washed out by dust and the harsh glare of a dying artificial sun. The council watched in silence as heavily armored council shock troopers, the elite of the elite, marched through the ruined streets of the human colony. The buildings were cheap prefabricated metal. The air was choked with gray ash. Primary targets neutralized. The voice of the strike commander crackled over the audio feed. Atmosphere processors destroyed. Life support failing. Estimated time until total asphyxiation of remaining populace 2 hours. Commencing sweep for stragglers. It was a textbook operation. Clean. Efficient. Then the camera panned toward a collapsed mining facility. Out of the dust, a figure emerged. It was a human. He wasn't wearing armor. He wore a heavy grease-stained environmental suit patched with silver duct tape. He held no energy weapon. Instead, he dragged a massive rusted mining drill, its heavy power cable sparking as it scraped against the rocky ground. The human was bleeding. A dark, wet stain covered the left side of his chest, and his breathing was ragged, audible even over the audio feed. Target acquired. Put your weapon down, the strike commander ordered in the video. The human didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He just kept walking, dragging the heavy machinery behind him. He looked up right into the camera lens. His face was smeared with dirt and dried blood. But his eyes... Henry heard someone in the chamber gasp. There was no fear in those eyes. There was no pain. There was only a cold, flat, terrifying emptiness. It was the look of a creature that had already accepted its own death and was now entirely focused on dragging its killer down into the dirt with it. The council troops opened fire. Beams of superheated plasma struck the human. One grazed his shoulder, melting the fabric of his suit and searing the flesh beneath. The human stumbled, falling to one knee. A collective breath was released in the chamber. Order was restored. Physics and biology worked. But then the human pushed himself up. He grabbed the handle of the drill with both hands. He didn't aim. He just keyed the activation switch and threw it like a spear into the ground directly in front of him. The drill bit caught the stone. It didn't pierce the troops. It pierced the high-pressure volatile gas main buried directly beneath the street. The video feed dissolved into a blinding white flash. The audio spiked into a deafening scream of static, followed by the terrifying sound of rending metal and breaking bones. When the dust finally settled and the camera feed re-established itself from a secondary trooper's viewpoint, the street was a crater. The human was gone, vaporized in the blast. But so was the entire front line of the council strike team. That was one miner. Walker's voice echoed in the dark chamber. Not a soldier, a civilian. He took a lethal dose of plasma radiation, kept walking, and detonated a fuel line that wiped out a squad of our best. Sullivan switched the feed. More clips flashed across the screen in rapid succession. A human woman trapped in a collapsed communications bunker, rewiring a life support battery to create a makeshift EMP, frying the optics of an entire council assault mech. A group of human children throwing handfuls of metal shavings into the air, intake valves of low-flying dropships causing the engines to seize and crash. A severely wounded human captain cornered in a med bay, injecting himself with a lethal cocktail of adrenaline and combat stimulants, just so he could stay conscious long enough to manually lock the blast doors, trapping himself and his executioners in a burning room. "They don't have a biological off switch," Walker said, pacing around the projection. "When you hurt them, they don't retreat to heal. They don't evaluate the tactical disadvantage of their injuries. Their pain just turns into anger. Their bodies produce chemicals that override trauma. We thought we were striking a colony of soft, fleshy mammals. We didn't realize that under the right pressure, humans turn into living shrapnel." Henry watched the faces of the delegates. The arrogance was gone. The grandstanding was dead. In its place was a sickening pale horror. The pacification strike was supposed to kill 20,000 humans and force the rest of their systems into submission, Henry said softly. Instead, there were no survivors on New Providence. Not a single human surrendered. They fought until they starved. They fought until they choked. They turned their homes into traps, their tools into weapons, and their own bodies into bombs. He paused, letting the weight of the tragedy settle over the room. And then, Henry whispered, the footage leaked back to Sol 3. They didn't send a diplomatic protest. Sullivan said, his voice barely a squeak. He brought up a new data stream. It wasn't video this time. It was logistical readouts, production charts, shipping manifests. Within 48 hours of New Providence going dark, all civilian traffic in human space ceased. Completely. Sullivan explained, highlighting a massive drop on a graph. No trade ships, no luxury cruisers, no passenger transports. The entire species just stopped. A general strike. Ambassador Hayes asked, his voice lacking its previous bravado. He sounded desperate for a rational explanation. A mobilization, Walker corrected sharply. A total absolute pivot of a multi-system economy. They took their freighters and stripped out the cargo holds. They took their passenger liners and ripped out the life support for the lower decks, replacing it with kinetic plating. They didn't build a Navy ambassador. They turned everything they owned into a weapon. Sullivan tapped the screen, bringing up a blurry long-range sensor image. It was a massive, ugly block of dark metal. It had no aerodynamic curves. It had no elegant glowing nacelles. It looked like a brick of cast iron bristling with thrusters and railguns. This is the UNS Vengeance, Walker said. A week ago, this was an agricultural hauler. They bolted 4 inches of depleted uranium to the hull, strapped a Class 9 hyperdrive to the back, and loaded the bays with unguided kinetic penetrators. Solid slugs of tungsten. No tracking systems. No electronic countermeasures for us to hack. Just big, heavy rocks moving at a fraction of the speed of light. That's primitive. Hayes scoffed, though he was sweating heavily. Our point defense lasers will melt them before they hit. You can melt a tungsten slug, Walker said, slowly, looking Hayes dead in the eye. But you can't stop its momentum. Liquid tungsten moving at fractional light speed still hits your hull. It just splashes. It burns right through the kinetic barriers and melts the armor like wax. It's not elegant warfare, Hayes. It's an industrial grinding machine. Henry leaned heavily on his podium. The fatigue in his bones was absolute. General, tell them about the psychological profile. Walker nodded grimly. When normal species go to war, there is a rhythm. Attack, assess, retreat, negotiate. You conserve your assets. You minimize loss. Walker pulled up a tactical map of the border sectors. Red markers began to bleed across the screen like an infection. Humans don't play the rhythm. They operate on attrition and terror. When they broke our outer pickets 3 days ago, they didn't hail the defending commanders. They didn't demand a stand down. Walker touched a control on the console. A scratchy, distorted audio file began to play over the chamber's speakers. It was music. Heavy, rhythmic, primitive. A driving beat of drums and the aggressive twang of metal strings, overlaid with a human voice, howling in a language most didn't understand. It sounded raw. It sounded like violence. They broadcast this across all open comms channels, Walker shouted over the noise before cutting it off. The sudden silence was a relief, but the echo of the music seemed to linger in the dark corners of the room. They jam our tactical frequencies with their cultural noise. They blind our sensors with dirty radiation flares. They don't just attack the ships. They attack the minds of the crews. We have reports of council captains suffering complete nervous breakdowns before the human ships even enter firing range. The sheer relentless noise of them. It breaks people. Henry rubbed his temples. They leave survivors too. That was the worst part of the reports. Walker nodded. Yes, they don't wipe out a fleet entirely. They cripple the command ship. They disable the engines, knock out the weapons, and leave life support running. Then they just fly past it. They leave the crew alive in the dark, floating in the wreckage of their own fleet, left alone with the knowledge that they were spared not out of mercy, but out of contempt. They want those survivors to tell the story. They want us to know they are coming. A low rhythmic pinging sound suddenly interrupted the briefing. It was coming from Sullivan's console. The young aide froze, staring at his monitor. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. "Sullivan," Henry asked, his voice suddenly very fragile. "What is that?" Sullivan slowly looked up. His hands were trembling so badly he couldn't hit the keys. "The navigation beacon. The signal," Sullivan whispered. "What about it?" Walker barked, stepping toward the console. "It stopped moving," Sullivan said. The chamber held its breath. "Did they halt their advance?" Hayes asked, a desperate glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Did they stop?" Sullivan shook his head slowly. He pressed a single button, casting a real-time system map into the air above the tactical table. A single red dot blinked in the very center of the map, right on top of the Council Station's icon. "They didn't stop!" Sullivan choked out, tears welling in his eyes. "They dropped out of hyperspace. The beacon isn't 4 sectors away anymore. The signal relay just caught up to the real-time telemetry." Henry felt his heart slam against his ribs. The cold dread finally crystallized into pure, paralyzing terror. "Where are they?" Henry asked, though he already knew the answer. Sullivan pointed a shaking finger at the ceiling. "They are directly above us." At that exact moment, the lights in the Grand Council chamber flickered. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the heavy obsidian walls, not a sound from the speakers, but a physical vibration traveling through the massive station superstructure. It was the sound of a heavy magnetic lock engaging on the outer hull. The humans had arrived. The groan of the hull didn't stop. It deepened. It became a physical vibration that rattled the teeth in Henry's skull. Dust undisturbed for centuries began to drift down from the high vaulted ceiling of the grand amphitheater. Then came the cold. The station's environmental controls were fighting a losing battle against the thermal mass of the UNS Vengeance. The human ship had likely been running dark and cold, absorbing the absolute zero of the void, and now that heat sink was pressed directly against the Council's delicate atmospheric skin. Henry could see his own breath fogging in the air. "Security detachments to the upper galleries," General Walker barked into his wrist communicator. His voice was steady, but the slight tremor in his hand remained. "Heavy plasma loadouts. They are going to cut through the roof." Ambassador Hayes scrambled backward, tripping over his own immaculate robes. "We need to evacuate to the secure bunkers. Henry, order the evacuation." Henry didn't look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "There are no secure bunkers, Hayes. If they can clamp a kinetic ram onto the primary hull, they can crack this station like a dry seed. We are already dead. The only variable left is the timeline." A sudden deafening screech of tearing metal drowned out the remaining arguments. It wasn't a laser cutter. A sophisticated species would use a concentrated thermal beam to melt the hull plating, maintaining atmospheric integrity through localized containment fields. The humans didn't bother with containment. They were using a mechanical breach. Gigantic hardened steel teeth were chewing through the station's armor directly above the center of the chamber. Sparks the size of fists rained down, burning small black craters into the polished stone floor. "Get back!" Walker roared, shoving Sullivan away from the tactical pit just as a massive slab of the ceiling gave way. The slab didn't fall gracefully. It slammed into the floor with the force of a meteor strike. The shock wave knocked Henry off his feet. The air in the chamber violently rushed upward, sucked out into the temporary vacuum created between the station and the human ship's airlock. Henry felt his ears pop painfully. His lungs burned. For 5 terrifying seconds, the mighty Galactic Council was suffocating. Then a heavy secondary seal slammed shut above the breach with a pneumatic hiss. The pressure stabilized. The air was breathable again, though it now tasted of vaporized copper, burnt insulation, and the sterile metallic tang of the void. Henry pushed himself up onto his elbows. His ears were ringing. He looked through the cloud of concrete dust settling over the center of the room. A boarding tube had extended down through the jagged hole in the ceiling. It was ugly. It was constructed of raw, unpainted iron and thick, ribbed flex tubing. It looked like the umbilical cord of an industrial parasite. The chamber was silent again. Even Hayes had stopped whimpering. Hundreds of elite council security guards lined the upper tiers, their plasma rifles trained directly on the mouth of the tube. Their weapons hummed with lethal stored energy. A single twitch of a finger would unleash a volley capable of vaporizing a light transport. Nobody fired. Nobody breathed. From the dark mouth of the boarding tube, a heavy metallic thud echoed. Then another. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate. They didn't carry the frantic energy of an assault team breaching a hostile environment. They carried the heavy, inevitable weight of an executioner climbing the steps to the gallows. The first human stepped out of the tube and dropped the remaining 6 feet to the floor. The impact cracked the stone beneath his boots. He wore a bulky, heavily modified environmental suit. It wasn't uniform military gear. The chest plate looked like it had been salvaged from a deep-core mining rig. The joints were reinforced with crude welded rebar. The helmet was a scarred dome of thick, polarized glass and blast steel. He didn't carry an energy rifle. He carried a heavy belt-fed kinetic stubber, a weapon that fired solid lead and steel. It was archaic. It was barbaric. 3 more humans dropped down behind him, identically equipped in scavenged heavy-duty industrial armor. They didn't fan out. They didn't seek cover. They just stood up to their full height, their boots planted firmly in the rubble of the council ceiling, and looked up at the hundreds of plasma rifles pointed at their chests. The lead human slowly raised a hand. He reached up, grasped the release valves on his collar, and twisted. With a sharp hiss of escaping pressure, he pulled his helmet off and let it drop to the floor. It hit the stone with a dull, heavy clang. He was older. His hair was cropped close to the scalp, graying at the temples. His face was a map of old scars and fresh exhaustion. Smudges of engine grease and soot marked his cheeks. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a month. He looked perfectly, terrifyingly calm. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the weapons. He looked directly at Henry. "My name is Commander Thomas Reed," the human said. His voice was amplified by a small speaker on his collar. It was rough, carrying the gravelly undertone of a lifelong smoker. "I represent the United Terran Fleets, who speaks for the dead. Henry slowly climbed to his feet, brushing the dust from his suit. He forced his spine to straighten. He was the senior diplomat of the Galactic Council. He had negotiated truces with the warlords of the Orion Spur. He would not cower in front of a primate in a scavenged suit. I am Henry, senior arbiter of the Council. He projected his voice, ensuring it carried across the ruined chamber. You have breached a sovereign diplomatic station. You have committed an act of unprovoked aggression. Order your forces to stand down, Commander Reed, or my security detachments will open fire. Reed stared at him. The human's eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. They held no malice. They held absolutely nothing at all. Your security detachments, Reed said slowly, are currently locked onto targets that are carrying active deadman detonators linked to the high-yield thermonuclear cores strapped to our backs. If my heart stops beating, my suit core breaches. If my core breaches, the Vengeance detects the flash. If the Vengeance detects the flash, her central AI detonates the ship's main drive, taking this entire station and a third of your orbital fleet with it. Reed tilted his head slightly. You can kill us, Henry, but you only get to do it once. A murmur of sheer panic ripped through the upper tiers. The security guards didn't lower their weapons, but Henry saw the barrels waver. The structural discipline of the room was breaking. Stand fast, Walker ordered, his voice echoing sharply. He stepped forward, putting himself between Henry and the human. You think you can bluff us, ape. You think we don't know how to disarm a biological trigger. I don't think anything, General. Reed replied, correctly identifying Walker's rank by the excessive gold braiding on his uniform. I know that my engineers spent the last 2 weeks hardwiring our life signs into a bomb big enough to turn this sector into a secondary sun. I know that my finger is broken from loading kinetic slugs into a railgun for 72 hours straight. And I know that I am tired. Reed took a step forward. The sound of his heavy boot on the stone was the only noise in the room. I am not here to negotiate a treaty. I am not here to demand reparations. I am here to deliver the bill. Reed reached to his belt and unclipped a heavy rectangular data slate. He tossed it underhand. It clattered across the floor, spinning until it came to a stop at Henry's feet. Pick it up, Reed said. Henry looked down at the device. Its screen was cracked, but a faint green light pulsed beneath the glass. He hesitated. Pick it up, Reed repeated, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an undercurrent of violence that made the air in the room feel instantly colder. Henry bent down and picked up the slate. The interface was crude, but the translation software automatically converted the human text into standard galactic script. It was a list, millions of lines of text scrolling endlessly. Names, dates of birth, occupations. What is this? Henry asked, his voice tighter than he intended. That is the census of New Providence, Reed said. He walked over to the edge of the tactical pit and leaned against the railing, crossing his arms. 22,416 names. Miners, engineers, hydroponic farmers, teachers, children. Reed looked up to the upper tiers, his pale eyes scanning the faces of the alien delegations. 2 weeks ago, your council authorized a strike to pacify them. You disabled their atmospheric processors. You poisoned their air. You shot them in the streets when they tried to fix the machinery. Ambassador Hayes pushed his way forward, his face flushed with a mix of terror and indignation. They were operating in a restricted sector. They were warned multiple times, the protocols were followed. Your people were squatting on council-claimed hyperlanes. We had every legal right to... Before Hayes could finish his sentence, one of the heavily armored humans behind Reed shifted their weapon. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was casual. The human simply rested the barrel of the massive kinetic stubber on the lip of their armor, pointing it vaguely in the direction of the ambassador. Hayes choked on his words, stepping back quickly. "You talk about legal rights," Reed said quietly. "We talk about survival. We knew New Providence was a risk. We knew the territory was disputed. We expected you to embargo us. We expected you to fine us. We even expected you to arrest the leadership." Reed pushed off the railing and walked slowly toward Henry and Walker. "What we didn't expect," Reed continued, "was for you to turn the life support off and watch them choke to death on camera." Reed stopped 10 feet away. He pointed a grease-stained finger at the holographic projector in the center of the pit. "Turn it on." "Don't do it, Sullivan," Walker growled. "General," Henry interrupted, his voice hollow. "Turn it on, Sullivan. Let the commander speak." Sullivan, his hands trembling violently, typed the command. The blue light washed over the room again. "Sink it to the slate," Reed ordered. Sullivan complied. The projection changed. It wasn't a list of names anymore. It was a structured table, a grim, terrifying piece of accounting. New Providence casualty profile, count classification, first-generation settlers, 8,412 civilian/essential infrastructure support personnel, and medical 3,105 civilian/non-combatant minors, under 18 standard years, 4,200 civilian/non-combatant, active defense militia, 450 paramilitary, killed in action, total eradicated 22,416, unlawful extermination. Henry read the numbers. He had seen them before in the classified briefings, but seeing them projected here large and stark in the dim light with the architect of humanity's revenge standing right in front of him made his stomach turn. "This is war," Walker said defensively, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Casualties happen. We didn't anticipate the civilian populace utilizing volatile infrastructure as explosive countermeasures. They killed themselves." Reed didn't shout. He didn't scream. He just smiled. It was a thin, terrible smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They killed themselves to take your butchers with them, General," Reed said softly, "because they knew that if they surrendered, you would just put them in camps. They chose the terms of their own death. But you pulled the trigger." Reed turned his back on Walker and faced the wider chamber. "Humanity is a young species." Reed projected his voice clearly. "We are loud. We are messy. We fight each other over dirt and water and ideology. But we have a very simple rule when it comes to the dark out there." He pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward the jagged hole in the ceiling and the black void beyond. "You don't touch the kids." The silence that followed wasn't just fear. It was a profound, suffocating realization. The Council, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, had treated a species like a spreadsheet. They had calculated risk based on military tonnage and technological advancement. They had entirely failed to factor in the terrifying variable of human spite. "We demand you stand down!" Ambassador Cole gasped from the third tier, his respiratory implants whining loudly. "If you detonate your ship here, you kill us, but the core fleet will glass your home world." The retaliation will be absolute. Reed slowly turned to look up at Cole. The core fleet, Reed repeated. He tapped the side of his helmet, which was still resting on the floor, using the toe of his boot. Bring up the feed, Corporal. One of the armored humans behind him reached to a panel on their forearm and keyed a sequence. The large holographic projection in the center of the room shifted from the casualty table to a live sensor feed from the Vengeance's external cameras. The image displayed the vast orbital space around the Council station. The pristine, elegant ships of the core fleet were visible. 300 capital ships, silver hulls gleaming against the backdrop of distant stars. But something was wrong. They weren't in formation. They were drifting. Henry leaned closer to the projection. The closer he looked, the worse it got. The massive engines of the Council dreadnoughts were dark. The localized energy shielding that normally gave the ships a faint purple aura was gone. They're unpowered, Sullivan whispered in horror, while you were busy staring at my boarding tube, waiting for me to walk through the front door. Reed explained, his voice flat. The rest of my fleet dropped out of hyperspace on the dark side of your local moon. They didn't fire a single shot. Reed pointed at the projection. We didn't bring enough kinetic penetrators to kill 300 capital ships, but we did bring 4 heavily modified cargo haulers packed to the bulkheads with raw, unshielded, electromagnetically volatile hypermatter. We parked them in the center of your fleet's formation, overloaded the containment fields, and blew them. Walker's face went completely slack. An EMP. At that scale, you would have fried your own ships. We did, Reed confirmed, nodding slowly. We killed the drives on every single human ship in the Vanguard. They are dead in the water, but so is your core fleet. Every guidance system, every plasma manifold, every life support relay, cooked. Your 300 pristine warships are just very expensive floating coffins right now. They aren't going to glass our home world. They aren't even going to be able to turn their lights back on. Henry felt his knees go weak. He gripped the podium to stay upright. The tactical brilliance of it was staggering. The humans hadn't fought a naval battle. They had executed a massive suicidal sabotage operation. They had permanently disabled both fleets, turning a high-tech war into a grinding infantry-level stalemate. Why, Henry asked, the word slipping out before he could stop it. Why cripple yourselves just to cripple them? Because we don't need our ships to breathe, Reed said. Our suits have internal scrubbers. Our people know how to survive in the dark. Yours don't. How long do you think those council crews have before the oxygen runs out on those dead dreadnoughts? 2 days, 3. Ambassador Hayes let out a strangled cry and fell to his knees. The realization of the total absolute checkmate broke him. You're monsters, Hayes wept, burying his face in his hands. You're insane. Reed walked over to Hayes. He stood over the weeping ambassador for a long moment. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked infinitely tired. We weren't, Reed said softly. We were farmers. We were miners. We were just trying to build a home in the rocks. Reed turned back to Henry and General Walker. You wanted to teach us a lesson about unauthorized expansion. You wanted to show us that the galaxy is a harsh place governed by apex predators. Reed reached into a pouch on his belt and pulled out a small, heavily battered object. He placed it carefully on the edge of the tactical table. Henry looked at it. It was a stuffed toy. A primitive representation of an earth mammal, a bear perhaps. It was heavily scorched, stained with dark brown spots, and one of its button eyes was missing. "I found that in the rubble of Sector 4 on New Providence," Reed said. "Near the atmospheric processors, right next to a pile of ash that used to be a mother trying to shield her daughter from a plasma burn." Reed looked up. The emptiness in his eyes was gone. In its place was a slow-burning atomic fire. "The lesson you taught us, Henry, is that the galaxy is full of monsters." Reed's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried to the furthest corners of the silent chamber. "So we decided to become the biggest, ugliest monsters in the dark." Reed stepped back from the table. "You have 12 hours, Reed announced, his voice returning to its harsh, amplified volume. 12 hours to evacuate the civilian personnel from this station. Any ship that breaks orbit will be allowed to leave, provided it is unarmed. Any military vessel that attempts to power up its weapons will be rammed by a human kinetic hauler." "And then what?" Walker asked, his fists clenched in impotent rage. "You blow the station." "No," Reed said. He picked his helmet up from the floor and locked it back onto his collar. The pneumatic seal hissed shut, hiding his scarred face behind the polarized glass. His voice, now heavily filtered, sounded less human, more mechanical. "Then we take it. This station is now the property of the United Terran Fleets. You are going to sign the surrender protocols, Henry. You are going to broadcast it on every open channel. You are going to tell the entire galaxy that the Council has fallen." "I won't do it," Henry said, his voice shaking. "I will not legitimize terrorism." The faceless human stepped close to Henry. The sheer mass of the armor loomed over the diplomat. "You will," Reed's filtered voice grated. "Because if you don't, I will have my engineers restart the life support on those dead dreadnoughts out there, but only on the lower decks. And we will let your crews slowly starve to death, broadcasting their final words on a loop across the hypernet for the next 50 years. Reed turned his back and began walking toward the boarding tube. The 3 heavily armed humans fell in behind him, walking backward, their heavy weapons still trained on the frozen security details. 12 hours, Henry, Reed called out without looking back. "The clock starts now, and if I find a single Council military officer still on this station when the time runs out—" Reed paused at the base of the umbilical tube. "I won't shoot them. I'll just open the airlocks." The humans climbed back up into the dark. The heavy mechanical gears of the tube whirred, and the boarding hatch hissed shut, leaving the Galactic Council alone in the dim light. Henry stood in the silence, staring at the small, scorched, stuffed animal sitting on the tactical console. The realization settled over him like a shroud of lead. The galaxy didn't belong to the civilized anymore. It didn't belong to the diplomats or the strategists. It belonged to the grieving, the angry, and the unbroken. It belonged to humanity. And they were never going to let the Council forget it. Panic is a solvent. It dissolves centuries of etiquette, decades of diplomacy, and the fragile illusion of civilized superiority in a matter of seconds. Henry stood on the observation balcony of Docking Bay 4, watching the grand tapestry of the Galactic Council unravel. Below him, the concourse was a nightmare of crushing bodies and screaming dignitaries. The species that had haughtily debated the economic sanctions of entire star clusters were now trampling each other to reach the airlocks of unarmed transport shuttles. The security detachments had broken first. General Walker's elite guards, the men and women who were supposed to hold the line against any threat, had taken one look at the dead dreadnoughts floating outside the viewports and dropped their plasma rifles. They had stripped off their insignias and joined the mob. Survival had cleanly severed the chain of command. "They're acting like animals," Walker rasped. The general stood next to Henry, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. He wasn't looking at the fleeing diplomats. He was staring at his own soldiers. "They are acting exactly how the humans predicted they would," Henry corrected quietly. The air in the concourse was thick with the smell of ozone-spilled ration fluids and the sour stench of biological terror. Across the bay, the boarding ramp of a sleek civilian luxury liner was lowering. A wave of panicked delegates surged forward. Henry recognized Ambassador Hayes near the front. The man had lost his immaculate robes. He was elbowing an older, frail avian delegate out of the way, desperate to secure a seat. Hayes scrambled up the ramp, knocking over a maintenance droid in his haste. Henry felt nothing but a cold, heavy disgust. At the far end of the concourse, the reason for the stampede stood in complete chilling silence. A squad of 8 humans had secured the primary transit corridor. They hadn't fired a single shot since the breach in the council chamber. They didn't need to. They just stood there, forming a loose barricade of heavy scavenged armor and massive kinetic weaponry. They were covered in grease ash and the weariness of a people who had crossed an ocean of stars purely on spite. They watched the alien mob tear itself apart. One of the humans, a shorter figure with a heavy welder's mask, painted with a crude white skull, leaned casually against a support pillar. The human was eating something from a silver foil packet, casually observing the riot, as if watching a mildly interesting nature documentary. Suddenly, the crowd surged violently near the human line. A young alien, a child of the reptilian Kalan delegation, easily distinguished by its bright green scales and small stature, was shoved hard by a fleeing bureaucrat. The child tripped, tumbling across the polished floor, sliding right to the heavy steel-toed boots of the human eating from the foil packet. The concourse around them went dead still. The fleeing mob parted like water around a stone, leaving the child isolated at the feet of the invaders. The child curled into a tight ball, trembling violently, expecting to be crushed. Henry held his breath. Walker reached for his sidearm, a futile, instinctive gesture. The human slowly chewed, swallowed, and folded the foil packet away into a belt pouch. Then the human knelt. The heavy armor groaned with the movement. The human reached out a thick, armored glove. The Kalan child flinched, squeezing its eyes shut. The human didn't strike. The thick fingers gently grasped the back of the child's tunic and hauled the reptilian youth upright. The human then reached up, popped the seals on the welder's mask, and pulled it off. It was a young woman. Her face was smudged with dirt, and her eyes were a hollow, exhausted gray. She looked down at the terrified alien child, then looked up at the paralyzing mob of adults who had abandoned it. She pointed a rigid, grease-stained finger at a Kalan adult cowering 20 feet away, presumably the parent. "Take him," the human woman said. Her voice was raspy dry. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. The command cut through the ambient noise like a scalpel. The parent scrambled forward, grabbed the child, and practically threw themselves back into the crowd, weeping. The human woman watched them go. She put her mask back on, locked the seals, and picked up her heavy kinetic rifle. She racked the charging handle with a loud metallic clack that echoed off the high ceiling. "Keep moving," she ordered the crowd. "Clock's ticking." The stampede resumed, but it was quieter now. The terror had changed. It wasn't just the fear of death anymore. It was the crushing, humiliating realization that the monsters from Soul 3 possessed a disciplined restraint that the enlightened Galactic Council utterly lacked. "They aren't here to butcher us," Henry whispered, turning away from the railing. "They are here to evict us." Walker didn't follow him immediately. "Henry, where are you going?" "Back to the Chamber General. I have 12 hours to draft a surrender that will keep my species from going extinct. I suggest you get on a shuttle." "I am not running from a pack of deep space miners." Walker growled, his pride finally flaring through his despair. Henry looked back at the old soldier. "Then you will die here, Walker. And the worst part is they won't even consider it a battle. They will just consider it taking out the trash." By the 11th hour, the station's primary power grid failed. It wasn't a malfunction. The humans had manually severed the main fusion lines to the lower decks, rerouting all available power to their own heavy haulers docked on the hull. The Grand Council chamber was plunged into a deep, oppressive gloom. The only light came from the emergency chemical strips running along the baseboards, casting long, sickly green shadows across the ruined amphitheater. The air had grown cold. The station's environmental systems were barely functioning, struggling to compensate for the massive heat sinks of the human fleet. Henry sat alone at the central tactical table. The holographic projectors were dead. The room, which had once held thousands of the galaxy's most powerful beings, was utterly empty. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, distant thud of human boots echoing through the ventilation shafts as they methodically secured sector after sector. He had a single data slate in front of him. On it was the document. It wasn't a complex legal treaty. It didn't contain clauses about trade tariffs, hyperlane access, or demilitarized zones. It was a single paragraph, stark and absolute. "We, the governing body of the Galactic Council, acknowledge total operational defeat. We surrender all sovereign claims to this station, its immediate orbital space, and the hyperlanes connecting to the Sol system. We accept full accountability for the unprovoked eradication of New Providence. We vacate this territory in perpetuity." Footsteps echoed from the dark maw of the boarding tube still hanging from the ceiling. Henry didn't look up. He simply waited as Commander Thomas Reed descended into the chamber. Reed walked differently now. The frantic pressurized energy of the initial breach was gone. He moved with a slow, deliberate heaviness. He still wore his scavenged armor, but he carried his helmet under his arm. 2 other humans accompanied him. One carried a heavy metal lockbox. The other carried a tripod and a bulky, antiquated digital camera. "The shuttles are gone," Reed said, stopping on the other side of the tactical table. "Your people cleared out faster than we projected, 98% evacuation rate." "And the remaining 2%? Henry asked, his voice sounding thin in the cold air. "Locked themselves in the secure bunkers on level 4, Reed replied flatly. "My engineers are welding the doors shut from the outside. If they want to stay in the dark, they can stay in the dark." Henry nodded slowly. It was a brutal efficiency. No sieges, no hostages, just total containment. "I have the document," Henry said, gesturing to the slate. "I have authorized my biometric signature. The Council's central AI has verified the transfer of authority. The station is yours." Reed looked at the glowing data slate. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he gestured to the human with the lockbox. The human stepped forward, placed the metal box on the table and unlatched it. He pulled out a thick, heavy sheet of pale material. It wasn't synthetic polymer. It was slightly textured off-white and carried a faint smell of wood pulp and binding chemicals. Paper. Real, unadulterated paper. Next, the human pulled out a dark glass bottle and a long, slender metal instrument with a pointed nib. A fountain pen. "We don't do digital for this." Reed said, his pale blue eyes locking onto Henry's. "Code can be rewritten. Biometrics can be faked. Servers can be wiped. When humanity makes a promise this big, we put it in ink. We put it on something that burns something that rots something you have to actively protect to keep alive." Reed slid the paper across the table. The words on it perfectly matched the paragraph on Henry's data slate, handwritten in precise block letters. "Sign it," Reed commanded. Henry looked down at the physical document. He picked up the fountain pen. It was heavier than he expected. He dipped the nib into the inkwell, watching the dark, viscous fluid coat the metal. "You realize this won't bring them back," Henry said softly. He didn't look up. "Taking this station, humiliating the council, it won't resurrect the people on New Providence. It won't unburn their colony." Reed leaned forward, placing both of his heavily scarred hands flat on the table. "We know," Reed said. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching sorrow that made Henry's chest tight. "We aren't doing this to bring them back. We're doing this so that every time your species, or any other species, looks at a star map, you see a massive black hole where your capital used to be. We are doing this so that the math changes." "The math? Before New Providence, the math was simple for you," Reed explained, his voice echoing in the dead chamber. "You ran the numbers. A mining colony of 20,000 humans versus the logistical cost of securing the sector. The colony was cheaper to wipe out. You made a spreadsheet decision." Reed pointed a finger at the paper. "I am changing the spreadsheet. I am putting a variable into your math that you can never calculate. I am putting fear in the equation." Henry stared at the ink drying on the nib of the pen. He understood. It was a terrifying, beautiful logic. The humans didn't want to conquer the galaxy. They didn't want to govern the council's territory. They just wanted to be left alone, and they were willing to tear the entire universe apart to ensure they were. Henry pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound of the nib against the fibers was the loudest sound in the room. He signed his name, his title, and the date. He pushed the paper back across the table. "It's done," Henry said. He felt incredibly old. Reed picked up the paper carefully. He blew lightly on the ink to dry it, then handed it back to the human with the lockbox. "Set up the broadcast," Reed ordered the human with the camera. The technician nodded, unfolding the tripod and locking the bulky camera onto it. A thick black cable was run directly from the camera into a raw data port Sullivan had abandoned in the tactical pit. "We tapped the main hypercom array," Reed told Henry. "We're pushing this out on every frequency, military, civilian, automated trade routes. Everyone is going to watch this." The technician flashed 3 fingers, then 2, then pointed at Reed. A red light blinked to life on the camera. Reed didn't straighten his posture. He didn't try to look like a statesman. He stood in his dirty, beaten armor, looking exactly like the exhausted miner he was. "This is Commander Thomas Reed of the United Terran Fleets," he began. He didn't shout. He spoke as if he were talking to a neighbor over a fence. "I am broadcasting from the center of the Galactic Council station. As of this moment, the Council has formally surrendered this facility and its surrounding space. Reed paused, letting the silence hang on the open channel. Billions of beings across the galaxy were listening to that silence. 2 weeks ago, the Council murdered 22,000 of our people on New Providence. Reed continued. They thought we would learn our place. They thought we would break. Reed reached into a pouch on his belt. He pulled out the scorched, one-eyed stuffed bear and placed it on the table in front of the camera. We didn't break. We just changed the locks on the door. To the citizens of the Galactic Council, your leaders are cowards. Your fleets are crippled. Your capital belongs to us. Reed leaned closer to the lens. We are not coming for your worlds. We are not coming for your cities. But this sector is now Terran space. If a Council ship enters our territory, we will not hail you. We will not fire warning shots. We will rip your engines out and leave you in the dark. Reed reached out and grabbed the camera, turning it away from himself and pointing it down at Henry, who sat frozen in his chair. Say it, Reed ordered off camera. Henry swallowed hard. He looked into the lens, knowing his face was being projected onto screens in 1 billion homes and 1 million command centers. The station is lost, Henry said, his voice breaking. Do not engage the humans. The war is over. Reed turned the camera off. The red light died. Get out, Reed said to Henry. There's a single escape pod left on the lower maintenance deck. It doesn't have a hyperdrive. It will take you 3 weeks to reach the nearest relay station. I suggest you start walking. Henry stood up. He didn't look at Reed. He walked past the humans, his footsteps dragging on the stone, and headed for the service exit. He left his data slate on the table. He left his career, his civilization's pride, and his understanding of the universe behind him. 3 weeks later, the rescue shuttle Zephyr intercepted a distress beacon on the edge of the contested zone. Henry sat in the cramped medical bay of the shuttle wrapped in a thermal blanket. He had lost 15 pounds. His skin was pale, and his hands shook constantly. The crew of the Zephyr treated him with a mix of reverence and profound pity. He was the last man off the station. He was the ghost of the Council. Sir, the young captain of the shuttle stood in the doorway of the med bay, looking hesitant. We've re-established long-range telemetry with the border boys. We have a visual on the Council station, or what's left of it. Henry didn't speak. He just nodded slowly. The captain handed him a data pad. Henry looked at the screen. The image was grainy, taken from a sensor relay light years away, but the optical magnification was clear enough. He didn't recognize the station. The elegant spinning spires of polished stone and glass were gone. The pristine rings of the botanical gardens had been stripped bare. The humans hadn't just occupied the station, they had cannibalized it. They had taken the heavy kinetic plating from their haulers and welded it directly onto the station's delicate hull, turning the diplomatic hub into a massive, ugly, heavily armored fortress. It looked like a rusted iron fist floating in the void, but that wasn't what made Henry's breath catch in his throat. It was the perimeter. The humans hadn't let the crippled core fleet drift away. They had deployed heavy tugs and dragged the 300 dead Council dreadnoughts back to the station. They had physically chained the massive kilometer-long warships together using industrial super cables. They had built a wall, a literal physical wall of dead floating warships completely encircling the station. 300 monuments to the Council's failure welded together into a ring of orbital shrapnel. Are there still people on those ships? the young captain asked, his voice trembling. Henry zoomed in on the image. He saw the dark, unpowered hulls of the dreadnoughts. He saw the crude painted symbols the humans had blasted onto the side of the flagship, New Providence. "No," Henry said softly. "The humans kept their word. They let the life support run out on the lower decks first, then the mid-decks. The commanders on the bridges died last, listening to their crews suffocate in the dark." The captain shuddered. "It's a graveyard." "It's a warning," Henry corrected him, handing the data pad back. "It's a scarecrow in a field. They built it to keep the crows away." Henry leaned his head back against the cold bulkhead of the medical bay and closed his eyes. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the psychological weight was absolute. He remembered the silence in the chamber when the human first dropped from the ceiling. He remembered the unyielding, terrifying calm in Commander Reed's eyes. He remembered the heavy, undeniable finality of the fountain pen scratching across the paper. The galaxy had spent 1,000 years believing that the pinnacle of evolution was the ability to build a cleaner, faster, more elegant weapon. They had believed that emotion was a weakness, that cold calculation was the ultimate armor. They had been wrong. The ultimate armor wasn't kinetic shielding or plasma arrays. The ultimate armor was grief. Humanity hadn't won because they were smarter or faster or better equipped. They won because when the council broke their hearts, the humans simply decided that they didn't need hearts anymore. They just needed hands to hold the hammers. Henry pulled the thermal blanket tighter around his shoulders, but the chill wouldn't fade. He knew it never would. Out there in the deep black, the lights of the council station were forever extinguished. In their place, a new constellation had been forged, a jagged, ugly ring of iron and spite holding the line against the dark. The humans had arrived. They had built their home. And heaven help the fool who ever tried to knock on their door again. The void is quiet now, but the echo of humanity's vengeance will ring out for 1,000 years. If this story made you proud to be a Terran, or if it just sent a chill down your spine, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm to keep our beacon broadcasting across the hyperlanes. Share this video with your crew, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another transmission from the dark. We are building a fortress of stories here, one iron slab at a time. Until next time, keep your suits sealed and your eyes on the stars.